everyone. Thanks for coming. It's nice and early. So my name's Jay, and I'm a world runner, and I've spent a great deal of my time and life thinking about worlds of one kind or another. Over the next 25 minutes, I'm going to try and unpack the title of this talk. And I hope that some of you will find it useful for thinking about your own worlds. I have 80 slides, so strap in. Let's start with myth. Traditionally understood as being the collective beliefs of the society or culture that serves to explain certain aspects of the world or human experience. But for the purposes of this talk and the wider discussion of worlds, I will simply say that myth is a product of a world's attempts to understand itself. But what are worlds? Everyone in this room is going to have a different answer to this question. But from experience, I know that I can sum everyone's answer up as, I know one when I see one. Defining worlds is hard, but then again, so is defining things like play and games. The philosopher Wittgenstein wrote the following about games. Consider, for example, the proceedings that we call games. I mean board games, card games, ball games, and so on. What is common to them all? I can think of no better expression to characterize these similarities than family resemblances. Similarly, Huizinga, the author of Homo Ludens, a book entirely about the role of play in culture and society, offers no definition of play at all. He can only offer what he calls characteristics of play. So, the reason that we know a world when we see one is because, like games, worlds resemble other worlds. And there are, as far as I can tell, only two characteristics that all worlds share. They are internally consistent and that they have an edge. Internal consistency. Events that take place within a world should logically align within the world's established context. This idea comes to us from the great-grandfather of all worlds, Tolkien. He thought that a world creates and generates a form of secondary belief. Inside of a world is true. It accords with the laws of that world. You therefore believe it. The moment that disbelief arises, the spell is broken, the magic, or rather the art, is gone. Worlds also have boundaries, an inside and an outside. Let's use the world of film as an example. When you are watching a film, you are on the outside looking in at the events happening on the inside of the world. You only really ever become aware of this boundary when a character addresses you on the outside directly from the inside of the world. And when this happens, we call it breaking the fourth wall. So we have these two basic characteristics, the what of a world. The next logical question is, where is the world? Where is the drama taking place? Presumably it's taking place inside the boundaries of the world. Or is it? Where exactly does the world's boundary begin and end? Let's use Star Wars as our example and ask, where is the world? In brief, it can be found inside the films, inside the books and comics and video games, inside fan fiction written about Star Wars, and it can be found somewhere in between a kid and their Star Wars toys playing on the floor of their bedroom. The world is spread out across all of these different media. Each kind has a kind of internal consistency of its own, and to Tolkien's point, each layer is some kind of true. But how true is true, and how do we sort this out? Very early in the 1980s, Lucasfilm began categorizing Star Wars content into distinct levels of canon or grades of truth. G-canon, the word of God or George, plus the movies. C-canon or continuity canon, material from the expanded universe, including books, comics, and video games. Basically everything that Disney blew up when they bought the franchise, which I'm still incredibly bitter about. S-canon, or secondary canon, stuff that wasn't very good, like the holiday special and the early Marvel comics. And there's also fandom, creations and works completely beyond Lucasfilm's control, or unofficial. And licensing, which dictates what is officially part of the Star Wars product line. So as you can see, the world's boundary isn't clear-cut, it's more like the skin of an onion. So we have encountered the question of canon. In franchise worlds, like Star Wars, the question of canon is straightforward. there are clear lines of ownership and control. This is how they manage the world's fuzzy boundaries. And you'd think that the question of canon in autonomous worlds is straightforward. Things are either on-chain or they aren't, and you'd be wrong. How do things that have occurred in autonomous worlds become canon? And who in your world does and doesn't get to say what is true about the events that occurred there? And by what mechanisms do they get to do so? This question is even more complicated when you remember that we are dealing with worlds that aren't a linear story or a franchise, but interactive and emergent. Autonomous worlds are a subset of a world type known as a techno-social system, a framework or environment wherein technology and social factors are interlinked and influence each other continuously. The key things that you need to remember about techno-social systems is that they have a techno bit and a social bit. And when we think about techno-social systems as worlds, they obtain a new characteristic. You can go inside of them and have agency there. But how did we come to think of techno-social systems as worlds in the first place? Dungeons and Dragons, the single most important social technology of the 20th century. The fusion of simulation and probability, role-playing and improv theatre, and storytelling. This is a no-shill zone, but see my talk Worlds of Walkthrough from the AW Summit in Portugal earlier this year for more on that history. But in short, what emerges from D&D is something quite unlike any form of storytelling we've ever seen before. Humanity's newest medium. D&D's innovation allowed people for the first time to enter a world, or rather a system, and collectively agree upon what was systematically taking place there socially. And what people experienced upon entering that system and having it spring to life in front of them was emergent narrative. It's not obvious to us now, but before Dungeons and Dragons, people didn't expect systems to tell stories. Think about some of the best-selling games of the 20th century: Battleships, Connect 4, Risk, Monopoly. You can't go inside of them, unless you want to argue that a Jenga tower falling down is an emergent part of the narrative, but it all falls down is a nursery rhyme, not a story. And then suddenly we get D&D. People could go inside of the simulation and find storytelling there. Systemic storytelling then explodes. Computer games, narrative board games, choose-your-own-adventure books, LARPing, the list goes on. All of this brand new for humanity. It's hard not to express just how colossal an impact D&D had on our society. Its innovations flowed into computing immediately. Dungeons and Dragons in 1974. 1976, we get the first interactive fiction game, Colossal Cave Adventure. And by 1978, just 4 years after D&D, we get MUD, the first virtual world. And the rest is computing history. Imagine the cultural vertigo that early D&D players must have experienced. The ability to zoom down from the point of view outside of the world, the view of traditional board games, films, and theatre, and step into the world and explore it from the first person. Imagine how this informed the way that people went on to build software. Almost all software, but as we know it today, is downstream of D&D's influence. Whilst we were on the subject of D&D, I'd like to point to an example of a myth-making mechanism, despite the fact that I haven't defined what one is yet. One that is common in D&D, but less common in other systems that it's had influence on, the map. In video games, the player tends to uncover the map or reveal the world map rather than draw the map themselves. A player drawing a map in the game of D&D is an example of a myth-making mechanism, the world trying to understand itself. By drawing the map, the player is documenting what narrative things are happening and making those events more solid and legible to the technical part of the system. And, I should add, from the perspective of the map maker, the map is true. So to recap, myth is the product of a world attempting to understand itself. Worlds resemble other worlds, and they need to be internally consistent and have boundaries. Canon is the process of sorting out what is and isn't true about the world. Dungeons and Dragons comes along and creates a new category of world that we can go into, and people make sense of events in those worlds narratively. So, emergent narrative. Sure. But where does it come from inside of systems? Is this playing? Yes. The video on screen was made in the 1940s by two Austrian psychologists, Fritz Heider and Marianne Simmel, who pioneered research into the psychology of social perception and causal attribution. They were researching how we construct and construe attribution when making judgments about what caused an event to occur. To put more simply, why we think a thing happened, and how did we come to those conclusions? After watching the film, experimental participants were asked to describe in detail their interpretation of the events that they had just witnessed play out on the projector. Now, we are all watching the same animation, but if I go around this room and ask each of you to tell me what happened, I guarantee you that each one of you will say something different about what you witnessed. And interestingly enough, so did the people who watched the same video back in the 1940s. The original paper shows that participants constructed elaborate narratives, complete with motivations and backstories, about the events they watched. Okay, cool. One participant explained that a man has planned to meet a girl, and the girl comes along with another man. The first man tells the second man to go, the second tells the first, and he shakes his head. Then the two men have a fight. Other interpretations included that the big triangle does not want to marry the circle, or that the big triangle was the villain and the little triangle was the hero, and the circle his princess. Jason Goldman, in his essay Animating Anthropomorphism, which is a title I wish I'd come up with because it's awesome, said the following: "The process through which we attribute mental characteristics to animated circles and triangles is a powerful example of we infer the unobservable mental features of a non-human agents as human-like. And this is where emergent narrative comes from inside of systems. We create it ourselves. Events occur inside of a system, and we make up the stories to explain what happened and why. But the thing is, how do you make sense of what's going on depends on where you are standing. Let me explain. So we have a world, and things are happening inside of it. Events are occurring, processes are happening. To use Ian Cheng's term, the world is worlding. But are you an external observer watching triangle and circles move around inside the world from beyond the world's boundary? Or are you the circle inside of the world watching triangles have a fight? Are you an internal participant experiencing events firsthand? So, we now know that our natural human tendency to interpret one thing happening after another as narrative, which is generated from the abstract sequence of events. But that's just one person. We can complicate things further by asking the following question: how we make sense of what's going on depends on where we are standing. Are we on the inside, or are we on the outside? And like the question of canon, how do we collectively decide what is true about the events that we experienced? The attentive among you will have noticed that I have just more or less threaded a path through the opening paragraphs of Luden's Autonomous Worlds essay. Where worlds come from, how they feel alive, and where narrative comes from inside of them. So, we now only have one part of my talk left to examine: myth-making mechanisms, defined yesterday by Arb in his talk on network states as a system for documenting drama generated by a narrative engine, or, to use the language of my talk this morning, a mechanism for documenting narrative generated by a world. It is a technical mechanism for moving the intangible information and experiences generated by the social part of the system into the technical part. It is, in effect, to use the language of a blockchain, a kind of oracle. So we need to design these mechanisms, and we need to imagine what these mechanisms might be, and where do we build them? Where do we place them inside the design of a technosocial system? Who gets to decide? How do they decide? Can the system capture narrative on its own, like using a diegetic LLM? And what kind of consensus and coordination mechanisms do we need to convert narrative into canon in the world, and what can we build? Should we put DAO-like structures inside of our worlds for managing narrative rather than a treasury? I have lots of questions. The British designer and futurist Adab Jain once said that design is choosing the choices that a user gets to make. But we also have the additional complication that we are building autonomous worlds on the blockchain, composable and moddable. Post-launch, AWs will evolve beyond the control of the original makers. Participants don't just have social agency inside of the world, but also technical agency to actively modify the system itself. This is a dynamic new era that I call all mods, no masters. So, from their inception, worlds need mechanisms to not only make sense of the events that take place inside of them, but also the technical changes made to the world themselves. We will need to build these kind of mechanisms in from the very beginning, or at least provide APIs for others to build on. We must design for and anticipate the architecture of choice available in our worlds, in addition to making choices about how people inhabit and interact with the architecture. I can't tell you exactly how to design these mechanisms, but we all need to do this together. I can, however, right now offer you technical words that we might use to discuss the potential sites of myth-making and where we might place these mechanisms, definitions of the conditions that agents may interpret the worlding of a world from. I have until now been using words like narrative and story interchangeably, but if we are going to be about the business of designing these mechanisms that make sense of emergent events that get produced in worlds, we need to define some specific terms. Plot, making sense of a sequence of events from outside of the world. Narrative, sense-making of the sequence of events as understood from inside the world. Story, defined as collective sense-making imposed from outside the world. And law, a collective sense-making imposed from inside the world. And canon, which is and isn't true about the events that take place in the world. This is my most important slide. Take a picture, or you can find it in the glossary at worldrunning.guide. Again, to reiterate, these are potential sites for the location and construction of myth-making mechanisms. I'm offering words, names, and definitions for the areas and situations where sense-making may arise during people's interactions with the world. Any world, not just an autonomous one. So let's try and think of some examples from games or worlds that we are already familiar with, autonomous or not. Plot, narrative, story, law. Plot could be the next sequence of events imposed by privileged people who can modify the technosocial system. A new season, an update that moves the wider context forwards, the next event in a sequence. Plot could also be an explanation of an event imposed from outside the world by fiat. It could also be the next sequence of pre-planned events built into or triggered by some other event or condition being met in the world, a branching storyline, for example. I've already given one example of a narrative event, and that's making a map. A quest log or a journal that's kept in-world would be an example of a narrative mechanism, or a language model to convert and document the changes in game state from one turn to the next into narrative media, like in network states. Story, people could write about your game. They could do this either in-world or outside of it, with the fuzzy boundary again. Journalists wrote about the events in EVE, which built up the story of the game, but people also write about events that happen in EVE in the voice of the world. You can look at BlazeBall news websites and stuff like that, for example, or at blogs that write from the point of view of a corporation in EVE Online. Fan wikis, fans can come together with their narrative experiences, each with their own narrative experiences of the world, and try to make sense together of what's going on in a wiki or in a forum. Or fan fiction, people writing linear stories making sense of events happening in the world. The early Raymond E. Feist fantasy books, for example, are literally just him writing up what happened in his D&D campaign with his friends, for example. And lastly, lore. Remember, this is collectively making sense from inside of the world. How about a high scoreboard on a pinball machine or at the end of a play-to-die game like Loot Survivor? Although crude, the high score was generated in-world and shows that there were people in it before you. The recent diplomatic truce between factions in Dark Forest over the exploit of an in-game bug, for example, is another example of lore. And people talking to each other in-game about the game. Players making friends in EVE by assassinating new players and then dumping lore on them about how you play is obviously an example of lore. Or we could do some other stuff entirely. We need to invent this stuff for autonomous worlds. I'd just like to end on the subject of navigation in worlds, how people navigate inside of technosocial systems, which is a whole talk in and of itself. But yesterday there was a lot of discussion about bots and how we might deal with them in worlds. In any system or world where value is generated, we will invariably need to deal with gold farmers and economic maximizers. Bots, AIs, NPCs, and people. The system cares not for how you identify socially, only that you have an identifier or inventory. And bots care not for the story or narrative setting of your world or its lore. Bots and economic maximizers navigate the world by its digital physics, the system and its rules, aka its lore. People, on the other hand, tend to navigate by the consistent and coherent internal social logics of a world, its lore, L-O-R-E. Perhaps we can, using myth-making mechanisms, somehow require all entities in our worlds, whether they be people, NPCs, or agents, to engage with the world's context. Force the bots and NPCs to have a sense of their own history and the world around them in order to navigate it successfully. Require them to act in a way that is consistent with the narrative logics of the world, as well as its physics. Unlike the approach in EVE, where they have made bots part of the story, how do we make the story part of the bots? Anyways, I hope that was interesting. That was quite a lot, I understand. But let's, as a scene, weld these new worlds together and explore this really exciting medium. I do still need to leave you with a question for the post-assembly, and my question is myth-making mechanisms in autonomous worlds? Thanks.